So yeah, I just want to ask you a little bit about what is your background. Could you bring people up to speed about how you entered the space, and what is it that really interests you about neurotechnology? Where do you think the space could be going?
Sure. Let me start with my background then. So I'm originally from Europe. My mom is a former ballet dancer and music teacher from Germany with Austrian roots. And my dad is a former CERN physicist who's now a historian in the Netherlands. And when I was little, we spent quite a bit of time living a little bit of time living in Brookhaven National Labs and in Winnipeg in Canada. So I kind of grew up with German and Dutch and English as mother tongues. And I think I realized very early on that what I was most interested in was unraveling the blueprint of the brain. And so I zigzagged my way over there, starting with studying physics in Amsterdam, and then information theory and an AI master's at TU Delft, and then coming over to Montreal to do a computational neuroscience PhD focused on the circuits of memory. And I continued that as a postdoc and teaching at Boston University with studies in hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. And at the same time, as I was doing that academic track, was of course getting in touch with people who were also interested in similar things and who perhaps had a long-term view of what neuroscience might be up to. And just about at the same time as I was lured out of academia by going to Spain to work at a neuroengineering non-profit there, and then eventually over to, of course, here to the Bay Area, and starting my trip through various startups, including Halcyon Molecular and 2045 Initiative, setting up Kernel down in LA, and now Vox up in Seattle, which I do remotely, by the way. I'm living in Seattle, in San Francisco. But what I met people like Andrew Sandberg, who you already know, of course, and I met up with Ken Hayworth, who works at Genelia Research and who is very interested in brain preservation, but also others like Ben Goertzel, who you might not immediately think of as a neuro person. He's one of those people who's like AI now, but eventually whole brain emulation. That's his sort of take on things, right? So the thing that I was most interested in is that because the way that we perceive everything around us is just whatever we happen to be processing in the brain, right? It's nothing else. The universe may be whatever the universe is, but the only thing we're aware of is the stuff that's going on here. I was most interested in what you can do with that. And because all the rest of the universe we're pretty much taking as a given that there is a materialist view of the universe that we can take as scientists, and there's a functionalist approach that we can take to the universe where we say you can express everything in terms of causal effects and functions. The same is true for the brain. So why not look at that as the same way that we look at DNA and we look at the body? You can also look at the brain the same way. You can say this is something you can take apart. Of course, all of neuroscience does that, right? We all have this look at taking it apart, understanding what the pieces are, but then you can also work with it. That there's no particular reason why you wouldn't be able to say make a prosthetic replacement part for a piece of the brain the same way as you want to make a new organ for the body, or you want to do the whole thing. Instead of a simple neuroprosthetic, eventually you want to be able to build an entire brain, but not just an artificial intelligence, meaning something that, that where you are inspired by the brain, but something that actually gives the same subjective experience as the brain does. So in 2010 is when we first set up the first iteration of the Carbon Copies Foundation as an educational outlet. That was for information about whole brain emulation. And in 2017, because there was a rapidly growing team of interested people, we converted that into a proper 501c3. So it's still pretty young, at least certainly compared with Foresight, which has a lot of history. So we're very young in that sense, but now we're focusing on both education and research advancement. And the main things that we try to do at the foundation is that we try to keep track of progress and challenges towards this idea of whole brain emulation, and to act as a hub for community that can connect people and try to spawn a few targeted investigations where possible. And we're a very distributed team. We have most of the people are either in the US or in Europe, but we also have growing sets of team members in Asia and Australia at the moment. I wish we also had some from Africa, but we don't yet. So I don't know what's going on there. And I guess, of course, Antarctica is kind of sparsely populated. So we'll see about that. Yeah, I think that's kind of the background. I think I forgot something that you asked me to talk about. So you might have to say it again.
Yeah, that's fine. You know, we have some time on our hands. Well, actually, in our previous existential hope sessions, we have one person from Africa who's currently building a neurotech hub in Kenya. So it could be interesting to connect you. But
that's
here
great.
We go. Then we can have another continent on. We can have another continent on the list. All right. I think that, you know, one thing that this group you know, is really good at deciphering is always just like give us, you know, perhaps like an optimistic outlook of just like why is it that we should even care about this? I know that you've given us a little bit of the background of okay, how can we even start thinking about this? But perhaps, you know, just take us all the way out. You know, what is it that we could expect if everything goes well? Of course, you know, I know that you guys don't like to speculate, but I think you know, like a hopeful and an optimistic approach to this would be.
Oh, we speculate plenty. It's just that, you know, we've seen too many people make very somewhat rash, perhaps speculative statements that then get taken the wrong way, and it's not fair to, I think, to display something that is just really, really complicated in a too sort of. I mean, it's great to be hopeful, but if you just throw all out numbers, it's not a great idea, I think. So, you know, so I tend not to do that. But yeah, you asked me, why should we care about whole brain emulation? Which I mean, I know you don't mean it this way, but it sounds a little bit surprising because it's like, why should you not care about whole brain emulation? What are the reasons for that, if you can tell me? It's a little bit like saying, you know, we shouldn't care about DNA or creating new organs. But okay, let's wind back a little bit. Last year, Anita Fowler, who we're going to meet soon, who's our upcoming president, she spearheaded the launch of an ethics branch of carbon copies. And I know it sounds weird that I'm going on that tangent, but we're not just considering the ethics of a world with whole brain emulation in it, but also of the process of getting there. So everything in between, from learning more about the brain, perhaps creating a neuroprosthetic or brain-computer interfaces, and who does that where, in what world, with what sort of attitude towards data and information and privacy and all those things, and getting there. But also the flip side, what would it mean to choose not to develop whole brain emulation? What effects would that have on the future of human civilization? And that's an important point, this human civilization aspect, because so the way that I talk about whole brain emulation often seems a little bit different from what people expect. They might say, okay, whole brain emulation, you want to talk about mind uploading. But I find that a very narrow way to look at it. It's kind of like saying, okay, let's consider nanotechnology, but only talk about aerosols being useful for chemical agents or something. You know, there's certainly a place for brain preservation, brain backups, and mind uploading, but that's just a tiny sliver of it. The real reason why it matters is because it's actually the next level of adaptability. You know, we've made one leap already. If you look at biological evolution, which is Darwinism, that's all about pruning. It's kind of a harsh process. Everybody who gets pruned out loses. You're gone. And then along came this type of a brain where we can do things that evolution can't do. Evolution is not predictive. Evolution doesn't look ahead at challenges and try to come up with solutions for them. But we do that. And so it makes it a little bit less harsh and gives us a better chance of actually adapting our species to what's coming up. And that's because the brain is plastic. It's a paradigm change from what evolution was doing. And this is sort of the next paradigm change there, because you go beyond the plasticity of mental evolution in a fixed brain architecture to something that can hop from platform to platform and change how it thinks and how it deals with challenges and opportunities in the universe, so that human civilization gets a long shot, you know? So the way I look at it is that, you know, if we're surviving and thriving, you know, these important things, if they require that we expand beyond Earth, for example, you also have a space branch, of course, here of the foresight, but also into virtual realms maybe, or just into realms that could be Earth itself, where we live alongside other agents. that are in an intelligent ecosystem. Then you need ways that you can, for example, experience at milliseconds and microsecond scales, or ways that you can actually connect and extend your thinking across many minds, or ways in which you can carry out working memory problems with more than 6 layers or 6 items, ways that you can actually hear radio waves or remember what just happened. Really remember what just happened, not make a construct based on something that is likely based on a bunch of patterns that you learned a long time ago, where you sort of take a cue and generate something. But even just simple things like having the physical persistence to be able to survive in an environment that's different from Earth and the timescales involved with space travel, for example. But there's a reason why we send robots to all these planets and not people. I mean, I know SpaceX wants to send people, but they have to build entire environments that look a bit like Earth just to do it. It's not how it was meant. So the real reason why I think that whole brain emulation is something to look at is, first of all, it's near term in a historical context. It may not seem near term to someone who's thinking, what can I invest in tomorrow? They may want to invest in neurotechnology at a whole, like they might want to invest in BCI, they might want to invest in neuroprosthetics, but you're not going to invest in whole brain emulation right now. It's not that close. But it's also not that far. So it's not like looking back to Egyptian times or something. It's more like, okay, what was neuroscience like 80 years ago? Or what was going on then? Did we even have computers? And then look next 80 years. So we're at the end of this century. And if you compare what happened in that last 80 years and you kind of think in terms of not necessarily exponentials, even just linear, and you say, well, what if neuroscience can continue to collect data the way it has and collect understanding and collect ways of doing things in model building, translation? Then, I would be disappointed if humanity would not be able to do something like whole brain emulation by the end of the century. I think that something like a fruit fly should be possible by maybe, 2040, 2050. I don't really want to speculate about numbers, but I'm just saying I would be disappointed if we didn't do that, because right now we have the ability. We have a worldwide economy, we have a worldwide infrastructure, and we have worldwide science. So if you ever want to do it now, because now we know that we have those things. And then you add in this extra paradigm that gives humanity this way of getting to a new Cambrian explosion of intelligences. So I think that's, it's in a nutshell how I think about it, which is not so much from a life extension perspective as from a humanity civilization extension perspective.
Yeah, I love that. Who here, perhaps we can do a show of hands almost, has read Age of M? Okay, well, not even that many, but I think like an interesting thing, we have a few here, an interesting thing really that, that pops up in Age of M is really that like Robin takes a pretty, economics lens and just asks like, even if we just uploaded humans, like where, what is it that we can expect from this on the short and on the very long run? And, really walks us through a few scenarios. And I think that, even just with a few parameters off, I think we do end up in quite different worlds. And of course, Robin is basing this on human brain emulations, but, in a later stage, there could be many other forms that I think resemble the human brain as a kind of as an impetus or as a substrate, even less. And so, yeah, I very much agree with that point that you made. I think you already mentioned if, like the long-term out, and obviously that is not something that people invest in now. And then you mentioned a few things along the way. Could you just perhaps paint us, if not milestones, but at least a few perhaps technologies or so that we can look forward to, like what are a few current technologies or a few like more near-term things that people could get excited about already?
Yeah, there's so many different ones. Even not even touching the brain at all. I think one of the very interesting technologies is just in the terms of understanding. So, for example, people who investigate the fundamentals of how the brain works, how it learns, which types of areas are working together to make it possible to filter out the things that you don't want to care about or shouldn't pay attention to, and which things to use. And in that area, you see people like, our good friend, Professor Conrad Cording, who's been running the NeuroMatch meetings to try to get everybody into neuroscience, who wants to put an emphasis on these kinds of very fundamental, basic aspects of neuroscience, like instead of studying every circuit, study how the brain does something. I think that's very useful for us to understand how we filter and how we see the world. It's also very useful for understanding, therefore, where mental problems or diseases come from, because you can get an understanding of how it shapes your ability to think when there is a problem with one of these basic circuits. And it also allows you to take this and then maybe move some of the understanding into AI. So I think that's the very, very earliest basic thing, is that understanding something about the brain helps us understand about ourselves and about how we can make things that think, in a sense. That's not yet really neuroscience or neurotech. Let's just say it's neuroscience, but not neurotech. But then if you go to the neurotech side of things, if we move on a little bit, then of course there is the pharmacological side that I know quite little about, but would love to know more, which is, the limitless pill, your neurotropic stuff. But interesting to me is, in the non-invasive area, are all the technologies that allow you to get a more detailed picture of what's happening in the brain, not necessarily a real picture like what Jack Gallant is doing to see what people are dreaming and what they're thinking about, but a picture even just in the sense where the data points that you're picking up, maybe with a kernel helmet or something like that, that you can use a neurofeedback that can help you achieve things that you want to achieve, whether it's focus, whether it's weight loss, whether it's less anxiety, whether it's just tracking how your brain is working so that you can see if you need to worry about age-related disease. That's something that's really, really close and maybe even already doable just with technologies that are here. Just shortly further beyond that, I would say that you have what we might call brain-computer interface technologies, where maybe you make the jump into something that is more invasive. Invasive to me is always a little bit of it's kind of iffy to me what's invasive and what isn't. Because, for example, if you have an MRI that you're going to be under very often, can you really say that these strong electromagnetic fields are not doing anything to your circuitry, to your brain circuitry? Well, they probably do, right? Because there are ions in there, right? So stuff happens. So it's not completely non-invasive. So by comparison, how invasive is it if, say, Neuralink or someone else like Paradromics or others come up with a little connector that will connect into your brain? It is a problem, because surgery is always a problem, and rejection, and the fact that things only last for a month and that there's inflammation, and these things are really a problem. But it's kind of the next little step, because in BCI, you actually get contact with neurons, and so you can start recording neural code. And that means that maybe you can develop something that will work directly with the way that the brain thinks, instead of having to go through another translation layer out there. For me, often, if you take BCI without any kind of neuroprosthetic, it's sometimes hard to see exactly what the benefit is, where you get that X times something, because there's always this translation between how we process data on the outside and how we process data on the inside of the brain. But neuroprosthetics are a very real thing, and is also coming fairly fast. The first kind, of course, is, I guess the cochlear implant is in a sense one, but retinal implants are very much a neuroprosthetic, because the retina is the most exterior part of our brain. The cells there do operate using a neural code that is similar to other parts of what we have in the brain. And then from there on, as you go deeper, there are many other opportunities. And one of the most famous right now, of course, is the hippocampal prosthetic that certainly has its issues, because it's not recording from enough places in the CA3 and CA1 regions, but it also already shows promise. It's one of those cases where you make a model that is specific to the patient. So in a sense, that's like what you would do for a brain emulation. These are not generic models. It's not something that you buy in a store and then just stick on there. It's something that is trained to be like the connection between CA3 and CA1 in that patient. And then in trials, you can see that patients do learn how to remember better using this device than if the device is off or if the device is on but creating scrambled outputs. So it really is doing something, even with the few connections that are there. So there's a market of neuroprosthetics either for that kind of repair or for suppressing epileptic seizures and that sort of thing that is coming around maybe in the next 10 years or so, maybe in the next 15. And then you get beyond that, right? Because at that point, you have a better understanding, having done these sorts of devices, of how the individual components work and which parts you need to model. So where's the scale separation between that, which is actually something you notice at the cognitive level, something that is part of our subjective experience, and what is below at the biological level. And this helps with the translation of data that you collect, for example, at Voxa, where we collect, from slices of brain tissue, structure data, or from big projects to collect a lot of functional data, either with calcium imaging or some other method, where you go from the parameters which you've just measured, because measurements are never really model parameters. You go from that to the parameters of a functional model, the translation step, which is really the biggest challenge coming up. And I think working with prosthetics a lot is going to help in that direction. But that's the further away part. So the near term, that's the things like neuropharmacology, neurofeedback, and brain training, diagnostics, brain-computer interfaces, neuroprosthetics, and maybe a few other things as well.
Fantastic. Well, I think, threw out a bunch there. I think maybe to, if you indulge me, then I will just share the tech tree that you've created at Vision Weekend. And know that you've already mentioned a few of the ones that, of the technology slides that we discussed, but to bring people up to speed, basically what we did at Vision Weekend is we created technology trees around different areas that people here are working on, with the intention that we create first everyone creates a node of the technology that they currently are working on, then the enabling capabilities, what they can unlock next, a final end goal. But they also think a little bit about enabling technologies, like what is actually required to move this field along, and what is a key challenge that they want other fields to solve. And so the whole idea of this being is that if everyone in our individual technical tracks, for example, our biotech track, our molecular machines track, now our neurotech and space track is doing this, we can build from the bottom up, node by node, individual technology trees, see how the work that individual people within one of our technical groups is doing connects, but then also crucially is what Foster's really interested in, is the interdisciplinarity. So how do you explain to other fields in a simple, easy way what it is that you're working on? How do you explain them what you need from other fields? How do you explain them what you may be able to work towards in the next years or decades, and where they can then maybe use that as an enabling technology again for the work that they're doing. And so that was the whole plot device at Vision Weekend to get more interdisciplinary work going. And Randal, perhaps you quickly want to walk us through your tree. I know that you've already touched on a few of these items, but perhaps it makes sense to have a
sure. As you mentioned, I did already touch on several of them. Also, I guess, when I interpreted this tree building thing, I thought, okay, I'm going to make a tech tree for the thing that I focus on, which is whole brain emulation, not a tech tree for, what can come out in the next years or something like that, like the next few years. So keep that in mind. This is around whole brain emulation. So I actually want to point down to the bottom first, which is the key challenge. I'll explain a little bit more in a second, but the key challenge really is this translation problem, because you end up with a gigantic pile of data, and most of that data is nothing more than a picture of a state. And that's not enough if you want, a working model, a working system. And there's been very, very little work on the so-called translation, especially when translating from structure data to something that works. The hippocampal prosthesis work that I just talked about is an example of trying to do translation from the functional data, so from functional recordings in brain to something that works. So there's some experience there, but unfortunately, that side of the enabling technologies, the high resolution, large scale functional recording in neural systems is lagging a bit. calcium imaging is fine, but the time scale is not great. So the resolution of events happening is not that great. And recording with electrodes is not working very well in vivo at the moment. The best you can do really is taking neural cells or a slice and putting it on an electrode array. That's where you can get all the data and stimulate everything. So for an experimental purpose, that's the ideal setting, really. That's where you can discover everything about causality between these elements and the components and come up with a perfect model that describes what's going on. Much better in the enabling technologies is the world of structural recording or brain mapping at every level, at the non-invasive and the invasive level. The invasive one being, of course, post-mortem. That's what I do, which is when you have a piece of tissue that's then been prepared and then it gets sliced very thin and put under electron microscopes, and you make an archive of all of these pieces and you scan and image them all and you create a three-dimensional creation of it. That is working very well in the sense that not only is it detailed, it's so detailed that you can see the individual vesicles containing neurotransmitter at the synapses so that you can count them and approximately see how strong the synapses are, to the scale of it, because right now the most recent result was taking a cubic millimeter from a mouse neocortex, and that took 6 months to do, but right now we're 10 times faster than that. So there's this exponential increase in the rate at which we can acquire that data. And then there are other sort of complementary technologies like optical imaging, the sort of work where Ed Boyden's been involved with, expansion microscopy, for instance. So there are additional ways that you can get scope and scale, and you can identify proteins and all sorts of things like that. So this structural scanning is just growing rapidly and going from the scale of what you would need to get a Drosophila brain to getting to the scale of a mouse brain to eventually the scale of a human brain. That's still, human brain's still a while away because it's about 1,000-fold increase from a mouse brain. But it's eventually going to get there because 1,000 isn't that many factors of 10. So the problem isn't that. Collecting that data is fine. Collecting functional data is more problematic. Then doing the translation is really, really problematic. The best work that I've seen so far is out of Genelia, where they've been trying to reconstruct a few of the visual neurons of Drosophila from the structure and sample properly from their distribution of possible parameters to get a functional model that works. The problem here is that to do the translation, you need to understand enough about the system at multiple levels so that you can lay down constraints, and the constraints allow you to do your parameter selection correctly when you're building models, because otherwise you have too many dimensions in which you can do these selections, and there are too many ways that your model could end up, and that's not good. So you really want to constrain what you've got. That's where this whole concept of scale separation in complex systems comes in, where you want, a computer is made up of a ton of analog components, a whole bunch of transistors. They're all analog. If they were just let to do their own thing, it would be a chaotic system. But a computer does things like impose a clock, impose parity bits for error correction, impose this notion that some level is above that, you call it a 1, below that you call it a 0. All that stuff, these are all constraints that are imposed to make that otherwise analog chaotic system one that is completely predictable. And of course, the brain has things like that too. Otherwise, one part of your brain wouldn't be able to talk to the other. And you would sometimes think that your grandmother was a tiger or something like that. So this would be very bad. The brain wants to be reliable and predictable. So the brain also has a bunch of constraints like that. And we have to understand exactly what those are so that we can put that on our modeling. And that's where the translation works out. And you can see from what I'm discussing, that's still a long path. But on the outside, what you get then are all of these possible technologies that we already mentioned, and then the end goal of all that, human civilization, paradigm changing thing. So I think it's worth doing the effort.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, again, for everyone, I'm happy to share the technology tree slides. I think that that does give a good visual overlay of the field. So thank you so much for walking us through there. Of course, I think it's a long path, but also interest has been really increasing recently. And so in the sense that there's been a few really great papers. One came out of FHI by Nick Bostrom and Carl Schulman. One came, I think, Holden Karnofsky started this really incredible thread on digital people. And so I think that interest is really increasing, one on the theoretical side, and then of course on the practical side. And like I think especially in the crypto arena, I think the BCI goals are at least a little bit more native than I think they were for many for many of the legacy institutions. So I think it's kind of interesting to see how interest in the field has really been wrapping up. Perhaps one final question to lead us into the Q&A, because we also want to hear from our participants, is one thing that Rick pointed out, and one thing that I was touching on with the fact that FHI published something on this, is like we as we move along, right, and something that you also mentioned that Anita is working on, we need to also monitor the risks pretty closely, right? And I think it will be really difficult to do that before we know a little bit, perhaps more about what the technologies actually are that we're building. And so one thing I think that Foresight is trying to do also over the next few years really is, in our individual technical groups, really rope in more and more of the people, not only across different technical tracks, but also that are actively working on the risks. Because I think, it is often the case for me, at least when I did philosophy, that I was and that I was trying to in my head grok the actual technical bits that will become relevant, and then try to create ethical theories around those. But I think it would be really lovely if over time we could actually emerge more of the ethicists and into our midst of our program. So perhaps you just want to give a few pinpoints of things that we may have to worry about rather sooner rather than later. And we had one question already, for example, on AGI, which is still perhaps a little bit further out. But yeah, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'm afraid I wasn't really looking at the chat, so I probably missed what was coming through there, and you can run it by me. But when we were diving into ethics, since we're pretty new to this, the first thing we did was just try to collect a nice long list of things that we could come up with that might be issues, and to then have conversations with professional ethicists, neuroethicists, have them come by and talk to us about how they think about these problems. And that's why we started breaking it up into, these are the risks during development, like all the things that are happening over the years as they're coming up. Here are potential risks that we might not even perceive as risks, but someone else might consider a risk because they have a different goal than we do, of a future that has whole brain emulation in it. We have to remember that not everybody wants to see exactly the same world coming out of this, right? And then there's the upside down, the sort of what happens if we never do this? What would happen to the world then? And what can we think? That's actually something I know the least about, as we haven't really explored it well yet, so can't say much. But on the development track, one of the things that I've been surprised to find is that many people aren't thinking about how the world is changing right now, and therefore which actors we think are going to be the ones doing a lot of the development. So we're used to, for instance, having the US and Europe being kind of at the forefront of all of this, right? And we have a certain type of society here that values individual and privacy and stuff in a certain way. But others who are coming up fast as the next superpower are not necessarily taking it exactly the same way. So for instance, you have to wonder, what does the development of whole brain emulation or neuroprosthetics or BCI, what does that look like, say, under the control of the Chinese government? And what do we think of that? Or what do you do even about that if you don't agree with how they would take it? Or how do you educate the government there on why it would be in their own interest, perhaps, to to have a more privacy-oriented approach or something like that, if that's something you care about. Then the other side of it is this whole business about outcomes, because even in AI, people talk about outcomes all the time, and they talk about the extremes very often, like AI destroys us all, or AI is our savior. But the in-between, where the question is, what kind of a world do people want to live in, doesn't get talked about quite as much. All we know is that maybe there are some holdouts who say, oh, that technology is bad stuff and I want to live in the hills and be green. And then there's some people who want to go all out on technology. And I think we don't often consider how much of the world feels one way or another or where we're actually going with this. So for example, if you have whole manipulation, if you have mind uploading, what does that mean for the people who don't want mind uploading? What does their world look like? And of course, then the other side is, what are the rights of uploads? You mentioned The Age of M, and I think a lot of people read The Age of M as almost a dystopian novel because it looks like work is kind of at the center of everything, and the people who happen to be really good at working on one thing get duplicated a billion times, and the rest are on the slow server. That's makes you wonder whether or not we really want to set up those societies based entirely around the economics of that particular thing. Now, keeping in mind, of course, that Robin himself also says it's a very specific kind of scenario that he developed. For instance, he left out AI. He did not include that a lot of the things that he had whole brain emulations doing there would be things that AI could be doing. So that makes it probably a different story if you try to see the interactions between all those things. So there's that too, and I guess the biggest issue, of course, when you're trying to do an ethics dive is that it's so hard to look any further than maybe the next year because of all the interactions between all the different possible things. So if your ethics dive and your consideration of risks is going to involve scenario building and possible outcomes, then that tree grows so fast. It's very, very difficult to predict anything except very large scale stuff like, should we still be individuals at the outcome of all of this? Or should it be okay to have hive minds? Should people be allowed to duplicate? Are you allowed to have copies or not? If you get an upload and you have a copy, who's married to your wife? That sort of thing, So yeah, tons and tons of questions and very, very few answers.
Well, yeah, just these few were mind melders. All right, well, something that I think, is even more important to just rope more people working on these areas really actively into the field to really collaborate closer with those people that are working on making these technologies real. Okay, perhaps we're already over time, but Graham, you had your hand up the whole time, so I don't want to close the session without at least having you ask you a question.
Thanks, Alison. Yeah, hey Randal, nice to meet you. I wanted a more, we've been talking about this sort of more philosophical ramifications long term. I wanted to bring it back down more near term to back into the neuroprosthetics, and just curious about the innovation there, because I've seen lectures by you and Ted Berger on this. I'm aware of those efforts, but I'm curious, like, what is the landscape there? What have we learned? What current innovation has happened there? And what are you excited about?
Yeah, from my understanding, the number of different regions of the brain that are being explored for potential neuroprosthetics is still very, very small. There's the hippocampus, there's the cerebellum. There's been some cerebellar work because it seems like you can replace cerebellum relatively easily, at least from a sort of what's the impact on cognition point of view. Then there's the retina, and I guess in a sense, there's also auditory cortex, the cochlea, and then the idea of having olfactory prosthetics, if possible. Not that much when you think about it, really. And some of what we sort of lump in and also call prosthesis is actually brain repair or brain support of another kind, like the NeuroPace epileptic seizure suppression device, which is it's a neuroprosthetic to me in the sense that it also gets embedded in the brain, and that you record data from the brain in order to make predictions about when an epileptic seizure might happen, and then stimulate to suppress that from happening. So it's in the loop and it's in the brain. So to me, that kind of makes it like a neuroprosthetic, even though it's not literally replacing a piece of the brain. It's something that has been added in there for a specific purpose. Beyond that, I guess, I don't know much about peripheral nervous system stuff because I just don't focus on that. But I bet there's stuff going on there because it's an easier area to work in. And there's so much interest, of course, in reconnecting, limbs and that sort of thing, and having replacement limbs. I'm sure there's tons of work there that I'm totally unaware of. But the reality is that many areas of the brain aren't even being studied for this, because either they're very complicated. Prefrontal cortex is really, I mean, you could try to replace cortical columns, but do you even need to? Because does that help compared to just the other cortical columns being able to take over what was lost? And then for that, it's a very complicated system. Hippocampus is super, super simple. It's just got this feed forward connection there in that area, and then a bunch of recurrent inhibition. Other areas are nice and external, like retina, so that you have the data on the outside. So you only need to do half of the neural coding problem. You don't have to go from an unknown code to an unknown code. So those are all things that make those areas easier to work with, and they've been studied very extensively. So you'll see more happening once you study more. So here's the thing that we're actually trying to spearhead. There's this thing we're calling the Virtual Brain Project, because we think that the methods that are being used by Ted Berger, even if you don't agree with the outcomes of their work, or you think that they have way too few electrodes or whatever, there's some really great stuff that they come up with in terms of methods, how to do some model from the recordings that were made, and how to make that applicable, and how to test whether your results are having an effect. All of that stuff is very useful, but it needs to be extended, because there are so many different ways you can apply electrodes, and how many do you need, and where and how do you arrange them, and what if the system is slightly different? What if there are more recurrence in it or something? So what we wanted to do is to try to get away from the problem space of you can't get in there, you can't really try this with patients or with mice or rats or primates. And instead, what if you can make the ground truth network yourself? What if you can design it? Like, you generate the network, you know exactly what its structure is, you know exactly what the operations, the functions are, you can record anything you want, and then you pretend that you're putting in electrodes, and that you can record only from certain sites, and you have physics telling you what it would receive, what it would give you as data. And then you try to do what Berger did on this network that you know 100% what's there. And then you can make it more complicated. You can make a network with more recurrence or more layers. You can start to train on what would it be like if we tried to do dentate gyrus? What if we tried to do amygdala? What if we tried to do a prefrontal cortex piece? Something like that. So the idea is, if we can control exactly what the ground truth network is, then you can learn methods. Even if you can never say that something purely done on models is applicable, it's always wrong. You can learn methods, and you can apply those methods then when you're doing work in actual areas. And that way, perhaps, you can then extend the work that they've done to other areas of the brain. And we started an exploration of that together with a group from the Human Brain Project. We didn't get the grant that we were looking for at the time, so it's still stalled in that area. But yeah, we're still trying to push ahead with it anyway.
All right, lovely, wonderful. So we went all the way out and just took it all the way back.